Hello and good afternoon. You are listening to Atiyah on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show on Ramadan Radio Wolverhampton, online on ramadanradiowolves.com. In this show, we hope to provide information that may be helpful to support your well-being and the well-being of others, because everyone's mental health matters. Our guest last week, Myra Khan, an accredited counsellor, shared information about the different types of positive self-care during difficult times. You can listen back to this on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel, alongside finding further mental health information on my Twitter feed at Atiyah 3. This show does not replace any advice given to you by your clinician. In the show today, we will be discussing relationships in relation to emotional well-being. Being mindful of our mental health is vital during these stressful times. How can we build on our emotional resilience? What helps? We are currently in lockdown 2 due to COVID-19 and for our well-being and to prevent the spread of COVID-19. We may notice we are beginning to worry about this again. Many of us may experience this lockdown differently to the first lockdown. Some of us may embrace it more and have a plan of action. Others may feel more anxious, unprepared, or uncertain about this time. There are many factors to take into consideration. Many of us might have experienced difficulties in our relationships and managing these during times of adversity. We were suddenly inhabiting varying roles, for some becoming teachers of different subjects, managing the mood of family or mood change within the family, working from home. Sadly, some people were made redundant from their jobs. We were unable to socialise as we used to, and this is still the case. We might have begun to notice tensions within the house. Some of us might have become carers for their loved ones as they experienced COVID-19. We might have been touched by bereavement. Others might have become more uncertain or more anxious about the current situation. Understandably, these experiences and other roles result in tensions within relationships. So today, our guest aims to provide insight into understanding this, emotional well-being, and looking at emotional well-being and strategies that might be able to support us with this. Our guest today, Dr. Roberta Babb, is a registered clinical psychologist, a registered forensic psychodynamic psychotherapist, an executive coach, and an organisational consultant. She has 18 years of experience working within mental health and the criminal justice system, within the public sector and the private sector. Her special interests include adult mental health, forensic clinical psychology and psychotherapy, race, culture and diversity, people, relationships, personalities, and team development, including organisational relations and dynamics, and the media. Welcome to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Roberta Babb.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So today, before we do focus on relationships, I mean, in your introduction, we've talked a little bit about psychodynamics. Could you tell us a little bit about psychodynamic psychotherapy and this approach?
Yes. Well, essentially, psychodynamic psychotherapy is a talking therapy. And I suppose it's very similar to psychoanalytic therapy. It kind of takes its origins from that. It's an in-depth and open-ended therapy in the sense that it's not really time-limited or session-limited, but it's really based on the theories and principles of psychoanalysis. So kind of think about Freud. And psychodynamic psychotherapy really focuses on understanding the here and now within the context of the past, and really seeks to explore people's lives, their experiences, their relationships, and patterns. And within my work, I use what the client brings to therapy. And I also use information from the relationship to help understand and explore other relationships and experiences in the client's life. And this might include how they feel in the moment, their response to how they feel during a conversation, or maybe after something either one of us have said. And we also use things like dreams. And we use this information to really understand the person, what they're struggling to find meaning or struggling to make sense of and go forward. I think one of the things I love about psychodynamic psychotherapy is that it's really suited to the exploration and understanding of most issues. It is a longer term therapy, so it's not always helpful in terms of crisis and crisis management, because it's not really solution focused. However, through exploration of your life patterns, your history, your sense of self, some clients do come to some decisions and solutions, which are really good. But it's really about thinking about, how do you make sense and understand who I am, where I've come from, and where I'm going to go.
Fantastic. And I'm guessing that, I mean, we've talked about psychodynamics, but there are other approaches that you do use. So there are kind of shorter sessions that you do provide.
Exactly. So I work in a very integrative way. So that might be my main model, but I draw in cognitive behavioral therapy. So thinking about people's core beliefs, their thoughts, their behaviors, their feelings. I also look at maybe the different thinking patterns people might have and where they originate, because that could help us. And also think about our relationships, our attachments, and they're generated from our experiences of being young and with our early and primary caregivers, and how that can impact our sense of self, our relationship with others, and the world around us.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Now, with regards to relationships, the pandemic has tested us in many different ways. During lockdown and with the social distancing in place, we tend to be spending more time with our families. There have been many headlines suggesting that there would be an increase in separation, divorce rates, etc. During this pandemic. Why do you think this might be? And do you think that's the headline scaremongering?
I mean, I think it's not a very helpful headline, because I think it's more helpful to acknowledge that the lockdown may highlight and create relationship difficulties, but it's not necessarily causal. And the reality is that the lockdown 1, 2, if we ever unfortunately come to 3, it will be challenging for a lot of people. But it also provides people a space to reassess what's important to them, what and where their boundaries are, and what they want or what they want from life. And it may signal a change or an end of a relationship, as lockdown is also showing people a reality that may have been previously easy to ignore or sidestep, because we also have less access to our regular coping strategies. So I think lockdown's hard. It's really characterized by restrictions and a lack of choice. And the other reality is that, by definition, couples, families have been spending more time together because of the fact that actually we have to be at home. So the different boundaries between different parts of our relational self, our social world, and our occupational world, as well as your sense of who you are, has changed. And this really does put a strain on relationships and exacerbates as well as creates new difficulties. And the interesting thing I think about when people are living together, a lot of the implicit things or the things that were just assumed start to become problematic. So you kind of have issues around, who does what, distribution of domestic chores and responsibilities. We also think about whose needs gets priorities. A lot of people are having to do more with less. There's less time, there's less space, there's more work. And you're also thinking that people kind of put themselves under a lot of pressure, that have a belief or the fantasy that everyone out there is doing better than we are doing. And so you kind of have that as a context, and then you throw in the fact that people are working at home. And I don't say from home, because we don't really have a choice. We're working at home. So they're having to share the home for work. So who goes into what communal area? Who uses what space? How do you divide up the thing? And then there's also, with this, comes financial pressures. Like you mentioned in your introduction, unfortunately, people have lost their jobs, become redundant, are on furlough. There's so much anxiety about the future. And this will naturally be stressful, which then will leak out into our relationships. And because the intensity and the relationship of this year to date has been phenomenal, it doesn't really feel like there's an end, and there hasn't been much time for respite. So I think people are also feeling really, really fatigued. There hasn't been much holidays. There hasn't really been much, rest opportunities. And there's a real sense of never ending. And that can be so stressful for people. And then you think as well, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. So I was just wondering, I mean, some people have underestimated the kind of impact on their lives, I suppose, and sometimes relationships are not put to the forefront. So there's a lot of stress and tension in relationships due to the impact on lifestyle. So how can people recognise their stress is trickling into their relationship? How do people recognise that?
I think the first thing is to just stop. The coronavirus pandemic and work and life and the 21st century is really characterised by go. And I think the first thing is just to stop and just take stock. And I think if you're noticing lots of little things really getting under your skin, it really means there's something going on. And I think the reality is that we're feeling more stressed. So we're feeling just more hypersensitive to things that normally wouldn't necessarily grate us. And I suppose the interesting thing about stress is that it's both acute and chronic. So, you know, clothes on the floor, the toothpaste lid off, the toilet roll not being refilled. These really kind of get to us because the more stressed we are, the less able we are to tolerate things and the more likely we are to snap at little things. I suppose you can be noticing, are you kind of like distancing yourself from relationships or interactions? Are you finding yourself just a bit more irritable and frustrated? Do your muscles feel tense? You know, do you just feel kind of lethargic? Are you feeling kind of really just frustrated or have a brain fog? You know, these are all indicators that we're stressed, and stress depletes people. It really saps our cognitive resources because actually it's kind of like we're in a heightened state of alert. We're in a fight, flight or freeze response, which means that actually we're not thinking in the same ways we have done before, and our capacity to problem solve and tolerate things has been reduced. So I think those are little things you can start to be noticing. And if they're coming up and really frustrating you, just take stock. Because when we're stressed, and if we have, for example, a little bit of a spat or a disagreement or an argument, I think what people don't really appreciate is that it can take at least 90 minutes for us to calm down and return to our baseline level of functioning. We don't often give ourselves that time and space. So it is about really just slowing down and seeing what can I control, what can't I control, what is important, but also how can I be a bit more compassionate to myself? You know, I'm having a normal response to an abnormal situation, and start to think, what is good enough? It doesn't have to be perfect, but what's good enough? And I think when we can be a bit more compassionate towards ourselves, we can be a bit more tolerant about the fact that things are different. We don't quite know what the future holds, but we can manage in the moment differently.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said there. 90 minutes, you said, to kind of return to any pre-anxious.
The baseline, yeah.
The baseline, right. Okay. So what strategies would you suggest for people to kind of help themselves return to that baseline?
Breathing is number one thing. When we're stressed or tense or anxious, our breathing becomes shallow. So I think, you know, you hear about mindful breathing, and I think it really is about just breathing deeply. So I often tell my clients or encourage my clients to take 10 mindful breaths. So when you're taking a mindful breath, you're really kind of like expanding your rib cage and really breathing in from your diaphragm, and actually breathing in for 4, hold for 2, breathing out for 6, because it's the out breath that actually calms us. So I think breathing is the first thing. I think the other thing is to then recognize what you're feeling, because I think people are often forgetting that because our world has so radically changed, what might stress you has shifted. And if we're not aware of what stresses us, we're not always aware of how to manage it. So you can think about, what is it stresses you? Is it now the doorbell ringing because it's a package or a postman? Is it the fact that actually you're having to juggle too many things, or you can't get anything quiet, you can't find a quiet space to actually have a call for your work? So you think about what actually stresses you and how you respond to stress. Because you might be someone who thinks about things, you may be very cognitively focused, you might ruminate about things, you may be someone who becomes very emotional, so you really feel your stress. You may actually feel it in your body, so feel sick or feel, you know, just panicky and tight, or you may kind of like act it out in your behaviors. And when you understand what your stress response looks like, you can then think about what you do to manage it. Yeah. And the other thing is communication. It's key. Communicate to the people around you about what you're feeling and actually what's happening. And when you're communicating, using I statements. Because when you say you make me, you haven't, that can actually put the other person on the defensive because it's very critical. But if you own it, I feel, and add it with a piece of sort of like evidence or an observation, because you've done this, or, you know, when you do this, I feel, you can start to have a relationship, a different conversation, if you like, which can be really helpful in managing our stress.
Right. And the communication, I can hear you say, is key, and how we do address certain situations makes a difference. Now, when you say about you're talking about these responses that we might have, what would you say to couples getting into unhelpful responses? We often hear people talking about compromise. And what does this mean? And are there any examples of ways that we could diffuse situations? And you've mentioned a few there.
And I think compromise is interesting because I think it's often sold as a big way to manage relationships. And I think compromises are well intended. And I think the idea is about finding a middle ground that meets both people's needs. However, they're not always met in equal proportions. And I think sometimes compromise can feel like you're giving up on your needs. And I think you have to rationalize the fact that nobody's perfect and every relationship requires different elements. And so I think in hand with compromise is also negotiation. Because I think actually, if you compromise, some people can start to feel a bit resentful because they feel they're the one that's always giving. So I think it's about thinking about what's the bigger picture? What are we trying to work towards? And I often think about relationship dynamics as a graphic equalizer. They go up and down, be more or less at different times of the relationship cycle. So you're thinking about actually, it's not my way or your way, but how is it our way? And then really thinking about what is it that we need to achieve? How do we do that? And then taking it step by step. And part of that is really knowing about what your agenda is, what you want to get from this, but also knowing what access to resources you have and understanding what can be changed and what can't be changed and what might be the rehashing of an old argument as opposed to really focusing on the here and now. So I think when people try to have discussions around an important issue and think about compromise, lots of things kind of come in, it becomes a gateway. And I think it is about how do you keep it focused and actually just limit the conversation to the issue at hand, because that's the thing that's really important. And you're thinking about actually, what do we want to get from this? What does it look like when we've achieved the goal? What resources do we have? How do we really use all the things that we have access to, even if we don't particularly want to? And I think then really thinking about how do we sit and then communicate this? Don't assume that, the other person knows what you're thinking. And I think don't offer things that are unrealistic and really stay present in the conversation.
So some people kind of suggest that starting afresh on a daily basis, or kind of parking some of those things, especially in the midst of the adversity and trying to get through on a daily basis, they might suggest starting afresh and trying not to focus on issues or past issues, let's say. What are your thoughts about this?
I think every couple's different. And I think the idea about starting fresh can sound really helpful, but that does involve the person letting go of what happened the day before. And we can often say things, but actually it doesn't feel that way. And so you still have the residue. So I think it's about radically accepting that you can't change what happened the day before, and actually being grateful for your partner, your situation, what you have going on in life, and actually reconnecting with actually what attracted you to each other, because that is about really kind of reaffirming your relationship bonds and realizing that every day you're going to try and do things different to make things going to be, different and better.
So how can couples create a space and time together during this pandemic? So we are talking about, you said, finding what's attracted you to each other, and you need to find time to find that in each other again, if that makes sense. So how can people create that space, do you think?
I think the first thing is actually to really understand the idea of the love language. So now, how do you express your feelings of love and appreciation to your partner? And so for some people, it might be quality time. For other people, it might be gifts. For other people, it might be acts of service. So I think what you're doing is actually understanding what does it look like when I'm saying I appreciate you. And I think then you're really thinking about how do we reframe what time looks like together? Because we don't have access to our regular coping strategies or the things we might have done. So actually it might not be a dinner out and then a meal. It might be the fact that actually we're here watching television or even just having a cup of coffee. So I think there's also something about little and often, and actually really valuing the opportunities you have to be with each other. And when you are together, to really focus. So, have a device-free time. No television, no phones, no computer, really kind of like sit and think and be together. And in order to do that, is about also identifying and maintaining work boundaries. There needs to be a separation between work and home, even if you are in the same space. And I think as well, you might even think about how do we even go to bed a little earlier so you can spend time with each other rather than just like flopping into bed all exhausted. And actually seeing what things you can do around the house together. You know, quality time and being together is about having a shared experience. It's about connecting. It's about intimacy, and there's very different types of intimacy. So you're redefining what time looks like together. It might be cooking breakfast together. It might be just seeing what you can do around the house. It might even be going for a walk together, or even doing a workout video together. And actually really being interested and curious. And for some couples, if life feels so chaotic, it might actually be doing, you know, a business meeting, you know, a relationship business meeting once a week, just a bit of time, half an hour, 45 minutes, where you kind of review the week, what's been helpful, what hasn't been unhelpful, and just really connect. But there will always be something important to do, but it's about prioritizing your relationship and investing in it. Spending quality time together and connecting is an investment in your relationship.
Yeah, and that's interesting. You're talking about kind of having a bit of a business type meeting, so really valuing your relationship and taking time out to discuss how you can move forward with your relationship in a positive way. Some people you find end up having this business type of chat, let's say tension and argument on a daily basis. You know, you did this and you did that, and you talked earlier about language and the importance of that. So would you say having the business type meeting on a daily basis would be kind of not as effective?
Again, it depends on the couple. Some people like to do things little and often, but if you're doing it on a daily basis, it might feel overwhelming. But people might like to do things and attend to things, you know, proximally, because actually to have it carried over feels even more stressful. So I think it's about knowing yourself, how you manage stress, but also how it might come out in your relationship. Some couples may be able to say, okay, this has happened. I'm not quite happy about it, but we'll discuss it in a few days' time, and be able to park it and move on. And therefore that might work for them. But for other people, it may actually just grate at them. They may feel very disconnected from their partner. So they kind of actually need to touch it and kind of like really kind of like get to grips with it in the moment. And I think the way that the couple will discover how best to have, if you like, this sort of meeting is to communicate and see. And it might be the fact that actually you check in each night with each other and then do the more businessy or difficult things once a week. But it's about, I think, having flexibility, because at the moment, things feel very rigid and it feels very difficult to do things. And I suppose we're kind of releasing ourselves from the way that things should be done or the way they ought to be done, and actually really focusing actually on these circumstances. This is the way that works for us, and that's more than okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, we are coming to a short break. I think this half of the show has been really helpful and informative. You're talking about encouraging communication, recognizing changes in an individual's own behavior, recognizing that actually it takes 90 minutes to get back to baseline. I think that's quite a key one to understand. How can people bring themselves back to that baseline before they then begin to speak or readdress the issue at hand, and access to resources. And we can touch upon that again in more detail if you want, I suppose, after the break. We're also looking at other family members after the break in terms of other relational issues. So it's not just the couple that's involved in relationships. You have many different dynamics within the family and the household. So look forward to speaking to you on the other side of the break. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. You're listening to Atiyah in conversation with Dr. Roberta Bab, with a focus on relationships during difficult times. You're listening to us on Ramadan Radio Wolves. Dr. Bab, welcome back. Each relationship within the household and other family members has its own place. How can these dynamics be challenged during the pandemic? Kind of setting boundaries, etc. What do we mean by this?
And that's a really good question, because we often talk about setting boundaries, but what do we mean by this? And the reality that setting boundaries is difficult at the best of times, let alone in the midst of a pandemic, let alone in the midst of a lockdown. I suppose, coronavirus is really forcing us to address these issues head on. And it comes to really thinking about how do we give adequate, meaningful time to ourselves, our work, our children, our partners, and our family. I think the first thing to recognize about boundaries is that they're about self-preservation. They're a way that you understand and look after yourself, because you're also communicating your limitations. And it's actually a way to keep yourself healthy and safe. They also kind of like identify and show other people how you would like to be treated and what works for you. And I think one of the main things is that keeping a boundary or even setting a boundary is your responsibility. And I think people who struggle are people who are afraid to say no, or they don't want to be a bad guy. But it's about actually not looking at that in terms of good or bad, but helpful or unhelpful, because boundaries are a way of like self-love, if you like. So I think the way that the family dynamics can be challenged is that everybody's in the same space, and that people's traditional roles may get blurred because, you know, people are being asked to do more things, or people are finding things are being left to them because, you know, work's taken over. So what the family environment looked like before is no longer what we see. And people are finding it difficult to adjust, but also communicate and think about these adjustments. So I think one of the things that you can be doing about this is, I think, again, to have, if you like, a family meeting, just to really sit down and acknowledge the fact that things are difficult, things have changed, and we all have to do something different in order to get through. And it might be the children may have to do a few more chores. It may be that the, you know, parents have to think about how they distribute the different household chores in terms of homeschooling, laundry, domestic chores. And it is about change, and it's about communicating that change. And sometimes people may actually have, if you like, a little board with different, you know, tasks on, and people have done that. But it's about not assuming anything, and actually not letting things fester, and not being afraid to say, look, we need to kind of stop and just take a moment to think about what's going on here.
Yeah, and that's important. I mean, you're talking there about the increased, I suppose, stress of parenting and the impact it might have on relationships as well. I'm thinking about the different dynamics of different aged children. So your younger children might be wanting to go out and play more, and older children might be wanting their private space, and living in extended families, I suppose, where many let's say Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities tend to be. How could we provide a space where we could kind of improve the relationships during this pandemic within the household? What could people do as opposed to?
I mean, it's really hard. It's really hard. And I think one of the things is having the courage to name things, but also having the strength to do things differently. And it might be the fact that you're having to name that, you know, it's difficult, and say no, that the children want to do something, or recognize that actually you might want, you know, your living room to be really tidy, but actually you just don't have the energy, or the children in there in and out. So I think there's recognizing there's less time for just general, and there's less time for yourself, and you're feeling exhausted, but you're also thinking about how do we really think about the different demands and manage everybody's needs to the best of abilities. So it's about, you know, compromise and negotiating, and thinking about what is good enough. It's not about perfection, it's about what's good enough. So you might also be thinking about routine. So, you know, the older children might have their time to themselves in the afternoon, but there's an expectation that maybe the family comes together in the morning. So the younger children, you know, can actually have a time to play and connect with others. There's thinking about also, if you're living with extended family, what roles do parents have of parents? Because it can be very difficult sometimes to manage those dynamics. And so it can be very difficult to talk to your parent about boundaries, roles, responsibilities, because everybody's coming from a place of wanting to help. But it is about how do we say these things with respect, but also know what battle to fight. We don't have to fight everything, and some things we may have to let go in the service of a wider context, which may be a more harmonious household, or, you know, for example, an easier life if you're feeling particularly vulnerable or fragile or very, very tired.
Yeah, we've had similar questions coming in through Dr. Bab in terms of couples being able to make themselves some space whilst looking after young children. So I think you've answered that quite nicely. And someone's talking here about the strain on marriage was immense during the first lockdown, and trying to juggle work and looking after the children and maintaining a healthy marriage has been difficult. So interesting in terms of the comments that have been sent in earlier.
And I would say the thing is about reframing, because I think, we want to do everything well. And it is recognizing that different things may have to take a back seat at different times. But it's about, it's not just about surviving, but trying to thrive. And it's about letting go. Change involves letting go. And we have to let go of the way things have always been done, or how we think things should be done. And it may be that we just have to think about, how do we keep connected? The children may spend a bit more time in front of devices or television. It doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you a realistic parent. It may be the fact that your child is, screaming and shouting because they want to go outside and you can't go. Normally you might want to try and quiet them down, but you may think, I don't have the energy for this. I'm going to let them basically scream and cry themselves till they're exhausted. That doesn't make you a bad parent. That makes you a realistic parent. And then you may think, things like, sexual intimacy might take a back burner. It doesn't mean that you and your partner are, falling apart or the marriage is heading for the rocks. It's just a realistic response to the situation. And you might find different ways to connect, which might be around the smaller things, a cup of coffee in bed, a cup of tea in bed, or think about doing things like that. But you're just thinking about, how can we do something different that does make us feel good?
Yeah. Another question that was sent in is somebody saying here, bear with me a second. Is there any advice for people living in extended families? It's hard enough without a lockdown. How do you, and this can so they're saying that it's hard enough without a lockdown and with your own spouse and kids, and with the in-laws in the mix, and this can negatively affect your relationship. How do you separate the two and not allow it to extend, or the dynamics to extend into the bedroom, enter into the bedroom?
That's a really good question. Again, and this is one of the things I love about psychology, the same sorts of strategies and skills can be transferable and applied to different situations. So I think the first thing is to be able to communicate and have a conversation with each other, and know that actually the conversation aim might not be about a resolution, but allowing us to feel connected and as if we're on the same page. Because often family dynamics can create splits and people feel that they're not supported, or they're alone, or they're, people are ganging up on them. So I think it's about addressing issues sooner rather than later. And I think about clarifying maybe what the issue is, how both people feel about it, and can they come up with a joint way of talking about it and actually maybe addressing it. And again, I think it's about using I statements, and if you like, complaining constructively. So if you're trying to address an issue with a parent or a grandparent, for example, again, you're thinking about how you say and what you say. So the feedback would be to identify one issue and use an I statement, and then how you response, or your response towards it, and then actually what you might like from them. And that might be about helping them to understand the boundaries and the rules of the house, the fact that things are different, but you're also examining the roles and responsibilities. I think everybody wants to be helpful at the moment. So it might be the fact that you may let go of some things and then hand it over, or you may say, actually, no. And I think the coronavirus is really hard for parents and grandparents, or parents, I should say, because it really highlights their vulnerability and their fragility and their own mortality. So I think you're also kind of like getting in touch with, what's the anxiety? What's the vulnerability? Is this person trying to prove something? And actually, does it do more harm than good to challenge it? Because actually, this is such a scary time at the moment. And people want to feel that their life has meaning, their life has purpose, and they're valued and wanted. So I think within the couple relationship, you're really trying to speak, communicate, connect, and try and form a united front on important issues by supporting each other. But sometimes you can't. And it's about then thinking about which battles do you choose to engage in and what do you let slide for now, but know that you can always come back to things in the future, because we're living in a very dynamic environment at the moment and things are very changeable.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit there about mortality and grandparents or parents of parents, and the anxiety and the tensions around that, I suppose, for children, grandchildren, as well as the parents, and that's having an impact as well. You hear people talking about worrying about their grandparents, or grandparents saying, make sure you don't send me into hospital, and those kind of tensions, and it affects the relationship, because you're having to tend to their emotional needs as well. that's an interesting situation as well, isn't it?
And it's very, very difficult because we're having to witness a lot of pain. And so sometimes the cruelest things are the most helpful things. But I think it's about, sitting and retaining your sense of empathy and connecting with the vulnerability and the anxiety, and letting people know that people might be scared about going into hospital, for example, or they're worried about getting sick, or you might be worried about getting sick. What happens to your family if you're not there? And I think having those really honest conversations connect people, because it's about getting in contact with being human. Coronavirus has shaken our sense of stability, our sense of familiarity, our sense of safety and security. It's a VUCA world. It's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so we are trying to help people connect with what it means to be human, because we all feel really, really fragile at the moment. And I think when you connect with that bit of being human and seeing people as human, you can have really different experiences, which may not solve the issue, which may still have the same outcome, but they may feel very, very different. And that's how you kind of like consolidate and really reinforce your social and familial bonds.
Yeah. So the tensions seem to be moving around the family, don't they? Especially in terms of extended families. And you're talking about perhaps grandparents who are retired and spending time together alone, and all of a sudden the whole family's there and present. Sometimes they get missed out.
Exactly. But also, if you think about lockdown, maybe people can't see their grandparents, they can't see their parents because of the lockdown rules. So again, it's constantly changing. So it's mainly about talking about how difficult things are and acknowledging it, but finding good enough strategies. So it might be the fact that you do have a few more online Zoom calls. You may set it up so you can eat dinner together. It may not be as satisfying, but what you're trying to do is ensure that people can communicate in a way that feels ordinary and doesn't feel too intense and isn't always problem focused, because the difficulty is a lot of our conversations focus on what's wrong, not right. And that can feel incredibly stressful and demoralizing. So we can try and bring a bit of ordinariness back into our lives through extraordinary means, such as use of the online space.
Thank you. Dr. Bab, we have some more questions that were sent in earlier, if it's okay to go through some of them. I think we've addressed a few of these questions, but somebody sent in a message saying that, had sent in a message earlier saying that in lockdown 1, all we could do was walk. What if your partner is against walking, and this can negatively impact a less active child, and so you don't get to do the daily walks and the exercise? So I suppose this person's saying that the encouragement is trying to get out and get some fresh air, and what if your partner is not into that?
And that's difficult. That's difficult. I think it's about talking to your partner, and I suppose again seeing, be curious about what's going on for them, why they may be against walking, but also putting into context the benefit and who's benefiting. Everybody's benefiting. It's an opportunity for your child to get out. It's an opportunity for them to be in nature. We know nature and being mindful has a really calming effect. So again, we're trying to understand that we may have to do things that we wouldn't normally do because they ultimately have a greater benefit. But if they really don't want to walk, it might be thinking about what other things can they do with the child that may also be incredibly active in the house. So it might be they might be playing games, like, or doing exercise activities, something that still engages a child and is active, but may not be outside.
And so how do people move away from the nagging? You said that they can think of exercise within the house and finding other family bonding time, I suppose. Is there anything else that you suggest people might be able to do in terms of getting away from the nagging, moving away from the constant bickering?
Yeah, and I think it's about understanding that, you might have to, if you like, agree to disagree. And actually nagging doesn't really solve anything because you're just going over the same ground. But it's thinking about, okay, what do we want to achieve? How do we go about doing that? And then thinking about real markers of change and success. So you might be thinking, okay, what else can we do? And really brainstorm, look on the internet, but also think, okay, if you're not going to do this, how do we redistribute different things? Because it's about making sure we both are, equal parents in this experience. And it's about reframing things as well to try and find, okay, what is the good that comes from this activity? What is the cost of not doing this activity? And then thinking about, actually, is this something that's just not going to change? So therefore, you might just have to radically accept it. And that's not about condoning or colluding, but recognizing it is what it is without any emotional attached to it, because that doesn't necessarily have a judgment. And then thinking about, with this baseline, what do I need to do? What can I do? Because you're thinking about what you can control and what you can't control. And often, if you like to use the word nagging, that comes around the things that we can't control. But there are lots of things that we can control within ourselves in terms of how we understand something, how we reframe something, how we may actually turn it into something quite constructive, but also how we may then talk differently to the people around us, because sometimes people feel the need to, make excuses or explain things away, but you might just be naming the reality of the situation, which is, this person doesn't want to do this, therefore we have to find something else.
Yeah. So during the current situation, we might not be able to kind of do certain self-care activities. For this reason, getting to know yourself better or creating an awareness of mood changes might be helpful. What do you think about this? How can people encourage that self-awareness you were talking about earlier?
I think it's really important. One of the first things I ask my clients to do is to come into their body. So really, just to take a moment, when you wake up first thing in the morning, take 10 mindful breaths and maybe notice, are there any places that feel a bit tense or a bit sore? Because it may be the fact that you might need to walk around a bit more during the day. It might be that you might need to do a bit of stretching during the day or something like that. So I think that's really, really important. The other thing is thinking about, actually, what is crucial, what is non-negotiable, what is negotiable, and what's optional. Because I think we put ourselves under a lot of pressure to do everything. And with all the different stresses that we're having to kind of manage at the moment, it's not realistic to do everything. So you're thinking about, how do I scale back this operation and really look after myself? And how can I carve out me time? And me time doesn't have to be having an hour-long bubble bath. It might be having 10 minutes in a corner, just listening to a piece of music that you really enjoy. Or it might be, 10 minutes just sitting down, doing some mindful breathing, just to center and, sort of ground yourself. So there's lots of things we can do when it's self-care. And I think another thing that's really important, I think, is touch. During the pandemic, we're characterized by the fact that we don't really touch or hug or connect with people in the same way we did pre-pandemic. So it might also be important to think about, how do we self-massage? So you might be massaging your temples or your head or different parts of your body, because again, touch is a really important thing that shows connection, that shows, well-being and self-care. And actually we are, deprived of that at the moment. So I think that can be a really, really important thing people can do. But there's lots of self-care things people can do. Also, if you think about change, people might want to just change up a few rooms in their house, change a pillow, a cushion. It doesn't have to be a complete changing room sort of thing, but change helps us feel different and it gives us a sense of accomplishment. So that can be important. And that can also be in terms of smells. So you may get scented candles, or you may kind of like cook, bread or cookies or something like that. Things that kind of make you feel warm and connected and comfortable, because this time of year as well makes it very difficult to care for ourselves, because we just want to huddle up because it can feel so cold and wet. So just nurturing stuff. And that might involve also what foods you cook, stuff maybe from your childhood that you really find nourishing and nurturing and comforting, as opposed to maybe a salad, which you might think that's helpful, but at this moment I need this. So being a bit more compassionate and flexible with what we do and what we engage in, and know that this isn't forever. It will pass, but it may just be a little bit difficult in the present.
Yeah, and those are very useful tips. Thank you. I'm just thinking about those people whose partners or who themselves might need some motivation during this time. Where could they get support from? And could you perhaps share how people could get in touch with you or access other services?
There's lots of things to support. I think people can think about what's in their local community. So lots of community spaces are coming together and having both online or offline experiences. The internet is a great place to kind of either find things that you're interested in. So there's different sort of online events, like maybe book clubs. People are, reading together. They're watching plays together. They're even being in plays together. So there's actually lots of different things we can do. And I think the internet is such a great place. We're only limited by imagination. But again, sometimes people do need a bit more support, and it may be professional support. So talking to your GP can be very helpful. or seeing what local IAP service, so increasing access to psychological therapies, is in your NHS trust. And you can often self-refer by the telephone or an online referral, and that can give you access to psychological therapy. Or you can find different therapy listings, or you can find myself. I'm on the internet. You can follow me on Twitter, on Dr. R Bab, or Instagram, Dr. Roberta Bab, or through my own website, thehanovercentre.com. So there's lots of different ways people can actually connect with others and know that you're not alone. And I think there's something really important about connecting with your cultural self as well. It can be really, really important. And so thinking about what celebrations are out there, what's happening in your local community, and just thinking about how do I think about things differently, knowing that there may be some downtimes that's quiet, but it's not the end of the world, and it is time limited, and we will get through this.
Yeah, and that's important. All of those things that you mentioned there are necessary, I suppose, to live a kind of well-rounded life to contribute to your well-being. Dr. Roberta Bab, there's some people that might shy away from things like couples therapy. Could you tell us a bit about couples therapy and why it might be helpful for some?
Couples therapy is really helpful, and I think any sort of therapy is important to think about as an investment. I think people often see therapy as a criticism or the fact that you can't, and it's about knowing that this is a space for you to explore and learn and grow. And I think the idea about couples therapy is to help the couple think in a helpful and safe way and have both voices heard and understood. So I think couples therapy can be very helpful when people are feeling very stuck, if they're feeling they're at a crossroads, if there may be a misaligning of values or directions, or if there's been something more fundamental like a bereavement, an infidelity, or even something like a job loss or a job promotion or even a job gain. So it can actually help couples just have conversations about things that are important to them. And I think people often think couples therapy is about deciding whether we stay together or, end the relationship. And for some people, that is part of it, but it isn't the only reason why people will find couples therapy helpful. It's about having a facilitated space with someone that can help you have a difficult conversation in a way that it doesn't descend into a shouting match, a very uncomfortable, hostile environment, but you retain thinking and in connection with, what you want from a relationship and who you are and the other person.
Yeah. So in a sense, for some people, couples therapy might be actually valuing their relationship and allowing a safe space to kind of talk about it with an impartial person supporting that conversation. And I suppose taking the conversations out of the house, I suppose, and having its own space for that. So that sounds quite valuable, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing. So even if you did couples therapy, for example, and it was online, it may not be out of the house, but you have a protected space, a dedicated space that that this is time to think about us. It's been prioritized, so it hasn't been shoved in between dinner and loading the dishwasher, but actually people are coming to this space with the understanding, the intention and the commitment to want to think about something that may be very difficult and they'd rather avoid, but they know that it's an investment in the service of their relationship because, this is something that's important to them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bab. Just to let you know that we are nearing the end of our time to discuss this important topic. So, and it's been very informative. Thank you very much. There's many things that I've taken from listening to you, and you're talking about kind of when we are feeling overwhelmed by internal and external adversities, and we might notice things like feeling more tired, there's more things to do, there's more work online, increasing tiredness, and you talked a little bit about sleep disruption, and children might be bored. You talked about understanding resources that might be helpful, and recognizing unhelpful behaviors and finding that time to kind of self-comfort and learn about yourself. So it's been really, really informative. Thank you, Dr. Bab.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great talking to you today.
Thanks. Thanks for taking your time away, Dr. Bab, from your busy schedule and helping us provide much needed focus and attention to emotional well-being. As mentioned earlier on in the show, you can catch more mental health information on Twitter, on my Twitter feed at Atiyah Ali3, and Dr. Roberta Bab has mentioned hers. You can listen back to the show and previous shows on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel. Thank you for listening in. You will hear from me on the first Saturday of every month, and we're hoping to base the next conversation around eating disorders. So another important topic. Thank you for tuning in today. Do listen back to this and other clips from the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show. Goodbye for now. Have a lovely weekend. Bye.